Welcome to Chapter 1, and specifically in Chapter 1 we'll be talking about key themes in environmental sciences. And the overview, we will be looking at major themes such as human population growth. This would be in terms of the environmental problem. So human population growth in terms of the environmental problem. We'll take a look at sustainability, which is what our goal is for the planet. We'll look at the global perspective. In other words, many environmental problems require a global solution. An urbanizing world. In fact, as you'll see later in Chapter 1, most of us live and work in urban areas. Now, you might not think that here in Iowa, but if we look at it in terms of the fastest growing population, or where that's occurring, we'll see here in a few slides, it's in some of the urbanized world. We'll also look at people and nature. In other words, we share a common history with nature. You can't really look at people and nature as mutually exclusive. And then we'll talk about science and values. In other words, science can help provide solutions. However, which ones we choose are in part due to value judgments. Now, let's look at human population specifically. Right now, the human population density is roughly a shade over 7 billion, having more than doubled over the past 50 years. Now, this increase in population, this doubling of population over the last 50 years has been quite dramatic, and we'll see that in a slide here in just a moment, human population growth. But keep in mind, over the last 50 years, it has roughly doubled. Estimates of the maximum sustainable population size range anywhere from 2.5 to 40 billion. Now, that's a large range in terms of maximum sustainable population size. And this varies in part because of differences in acceptable standards of quality of life. Obviously, as we add more people to the planet and we begin to deplete some of the natural resources, sustainability, or the quality of life, I should say, begins to decrease. The history of human population, like I said, as you'll see here in a moment, has been one of exponential growth, punctuated by regional scale fluctuations due to famine and communicable diseases, especially in some of the underdeveloped portions of the world, third world countries. Now, science in itself has done quite a bit to reduce both and to increase the speed of population growth, particularly by reducing infant mortality. However, in a few slides we're going to see that infant mortality is quite high in portions of the continent of Africa, and you'll see that here in just a moment. However, human population cannot grow indefinitely. There is an upper limit, and what that upper limit is, 2.5 to 40 billion, we don't know what that is yet, but science is trying to quantify that. So human population, the short end of this, is a critical aspect of many environmental issues that we have. Now, in terms of the 6 interrelated themes, again, we're going to talk about several of these in depth, but human population growth, sustainability, a global perspective, an urbanizing world, people and nature, and science and values. We've talked briefly about that. But let's look at human population growth. I was talking about this just a few moments ago. Now, what you are looking at is your first graph, first of many graphs that you will see in this course as we go through the semester. Now, many of you have seen graphs in high school, in middle school, and so what we have is an XY graph here. The x-axis in this particular graph are the different centuries, the 1700s, 1800s, so this is going in increments of 50. So this particular graph goes back to 1750 all the way out to 2100. Now the y-axis is listed as billions of people. Okay, so you've got an X and a Y graph here. So we're looking at how population has changed and projected to change as we go through the years. Also notice that we have three different colored areas. Down here, the darkest purple is the developed regions of the world. And then this larger, lighter purple is developing regions, such as the continent of Africa is one example that comes to mind. Some of the developed regions would be North America, China, Great Britain, France, Germany, Australia, and then you have the developing regions. Now this line here at the top of the light purple is the combination of the developed regions and the developed regions. So if we go back to 1750, we saw that developed regions of the world was roughly about just a shade over, let's see, if this is 1 million here, so this was probably about 250,000 people, about 250,000 people that lived in developed regions. You had many more in terms of developing regions. You had a larger population here, probably closer to about 500,000 total that lived in developing regions. And together these make roughly about 750,000 people back in 1750. Now if we look through time at this particular graph, notice that in the developed regions we've had some increases, a small decrease or a flat population growth here between 1850 and 1900. And then you begin to see a gradual rise as we head into the 1950s of developed regions. And then again, a little bit more steep rise. But overall, the trend of growth has been slightly positive for developed regions of the globe. However, look at this lighter shade of purple that corresponds to developing regions. Now again, it went along slight increases as we went through time, hit the 1900s, and now notice the slope of this line here. Now slope, you remember, is rise over run, so it's a change in population with time, and now you begin to see this really steep increase of developing region populations. The total population is up here, this top line. But you begin to see this rather steep slope from about 1950 up to about 2015 right here. We've had our largest rate of growth, and it's been due mainly to developing regions of the world. So that's really what has been driving the total population growth here. So in a short span from 1950 to 2015, which is roughly here, we've had a strong increase, a very strong slope. And it's projected to continue out through the middle part of this century and then flatten out around 2100 in terms of total world population. Now again, this is in billions. I'm sorry, I was saying millions earlier, but this is in terms of billions of people. So by about 2050, our total population will be nearing 10 billion, according to this particular chart, is what they're projecting. Now what we have to determine as a society is that can we support this many people on the planet? And in fact, notice from 1950 to 2015, we have really taxed our resources, or we've had to tax our resources. In other words, we've had to use our natural resources quite a bit to try and sustain the quality of life over a 65-year period. So if you have parents that are in their mid-60s or grandparents in their mid-60s, they have seen a population explosion. And that can cause some challenges for our environment. And some of the byproducts of this rapid growth has been in terms of famine and food crisis. And in fact, in the mid-1970s, there was a drought in the Sahel region of Africa, and roughly 500,000 Africans starved to death, and millions more were permanently affected by malnutrition. This particular region in Africa and nations in southern Africa have been similarly affected since then by periodic droughts. We've heard about droughts in the 80s, the 90s, and the new millennium. And so that has continued. So there's this feedback between population growth, poor farming techniques, deforestation, drought, and desertification that have impacted our natural resources. So this incredible growth of population in the last 65 years has provided quite a bit of challenge, and as we know, across the world has been led to political unrest, and so that is a challenge. Some of this challenge, and so what happens when the resources are used so extensively to satisfy the needs of this increasing population, this leads to a rise in fuel cost. The rising fuel cost and food costs contributed to emerging global food crisis in the first decade of the 21st century. The rising cost of oil back in the 90s and the early part of the new millennium used to produce food, and the conversion of some corn product production to biofuels are factors in this as well. So we face a dilemma of values. If you think about it, science provides the mean to increase agricultural production. We've seen this, and we've seen this with genetically enhanced corn and pork and some of our other foods. So science has tried to provide, in part, a solution to the rising population that we've had. However, the conservation of natural resources that are required to sustain the human population requires that its growth be controlled. In other words, there's a finite limit there. And one of the charts here that it's kind of a sad situation, but what you're looking at here is malnutrition of children under the age of 5 by region. And you've got a lot going on in this graph, but here we're looking at percent of children less than 5 who are underweight, areas in green, which you see North and South America, less than 10% of the less than 10% of children under the age of 5 are underweight. But you go into some of the underdeveloped regions. We talked about the Sahel region. We see that anywhere from 30 to 40+% of children under 5 are underweight. You look at India, it's almost half of the children under 5 that are malnourished. And you see here there's some data that's missing. We don't have data from Australia, from Russia, and from Canada, and Greenland as well. But you can see in some of the developing countries, some of the political unrest, some of the climate change that has occurred has led to malnutrition. So one of the things that we need to ask ourselves in terms of human population and the incidence of natural disasters, growing populations have increased human density. Okay, in other words, we are packing more people in smaller places on this planet. So what ends up happening is by putting more people in more areas, this increases the likelihood that a natural disaster will have high human costs and property costs. Think about this for a moment. Where are people building, let's say some of the more affluent people throughout the world? They're building their summer homes along the beaches. If you look just at the U.S., we're seeing more beach homes, more summer homes built down in Florida, Texas, along the coast. And what impacts these regions during the summer? Well, hurricanes, tropical storms. So here in the U.S., we're putting expensive property, fitting in a lot of people into these areas where natural disasters occur. So it's not necessarily that natural disasters are increasing, although there is some talk about that occurring if global warming is actually occurring. But if we just ignore that argument for the moment, we're placing more people in harm's way. And so those are the things that you have to watch for. If you look at the West Coast, you look at California, a lot of expensive homes are being built in areas where extensive mudslides occur. Also, houses out in California are built along faults where earthquakes can occur. And so the more people we have in these areas, the more cost to human life in that particular type of situation. Now, one thing to keep in mind, however, is that with the increase in population, if we are matching this increase of population with an ingenuity to resolve the resulting negative impacts, we can argue that the rise in human numbers is not really a problem. This argument, however, assumes that political, economic, and environmental conditions permit creativity and innovation. And we know in the real world that doesn't necessarily exist. So at some level of population, the ecosystem failure is likely to be inevitable, no matter how much resources or funding we put into political, economic, or environmental conditions. There is a finite population. There's a limit that we begin to deplete resources and begin to have a lower standard of living. If not for ourselves, it would be for future generations. So in that vein, let's look at something called sustainability and carry capacity. So the question is, how many can we hold? How many people can we hold on the planet? Well, a sustainable human population can only be reached when the resources that support this population are used in a sustained way. Currently, many of our resources that you see here, such as minerals, petroleum, groundwater, land, and wildlife, they're not being utilized in a sustainable manner. So, what is the objective of a sustainable environment? Well, it depends on what you're talking about. Sustainability has several meanings. If we look at it in the context of a resource, basically it refers to a rate of harvest or consumption of that resource that does not exceed the capacity of the resource to regenerate or to be recycled. Okay, that's one way. If we look at it in terms of an ecosystem, then sustainability is the use of an ecosystem's resources in a way that maintains essential functions and properties, such as productivity and biodiversity. Now, if we look at sustainable development in terms of an economic context, what we're referring to is economic development that can be maintained for an indefinite time without depleting the resources that support it and is socially just to all people. If we look at terms of a sustainable global economy, this applies the same principle to the entire planet. Now, there are actually multiple ways of, or I should say multiple attributes of a sustainable economy. Achieving the sustainable global economy requires that we develop effective population and control strategy. Looking to completely restructure our energy programs, which that has, at least since the 60s and 70s, that has been looked at. We can institute some economic planning, including a tax structure, for instance, that will encourage population control and wise use of resources. And then to implement social, legal, political, and educational changes that help to maintain a quality local, regional, and global environment. Easy to say, but difficult to do. So in terms of moving towards sustainability, we're looking at a new paradigm to our present model for running society and creating wealth. It should be evolutionary in values rather than revolutionary, inclusive, not exclusive of all people of the earth, proactive instead of being reactive, looking ahead for possible issues and coming up with ways to mitigate those types of issues. Focused on attracting people, not attacking them, and then of course assisting the disadvantaged and not taking advantage of them. So those are the things that we could do to move towards sustainability. And I think we are making incremental steps to that. Now, I've talked about carrying capacity. Let's talk about carrying capacity. We can look at it basically as the maximum population size that can persist indefinitely without depleting the resources that support it. So at some point, we reach a capacity where we're using resources without depleting them. Now, note that achieving this maximum carrying capacity may not be a desirable objective for all the human population, because then we could have a decrease of quality of life. So we must ask ourselves, what is the human carrying capacity of the earth? What are some options involving quality of life and proper human health? How are we going to achieve this? By choice and planning, or by famine, war, and disease? Now, when we talk about carrying capacity, we're talking about a global perspective. Things that occur in one part of the world can have an impact on many other parts of the world. So we've seen that human population size, we saw from the graphs earlier, has now reached a scale where the environmental impacts are global. They are no longer regional. There are some regional impacts, but we're now seeing global impacts to the environment. And this is going to require cooperation among nations. It's not something we can do by ourselves. One example of this is CO2 levels. Recently, I believe it was last week, as of this taping, there was a conference on global climate change in France, where scientists and politicians have gotten together to describe, or actually to look at, issues related to global climate change, specifically global warming. The buildup of CO2, carbon dioxide, it's a global problem. It crosses international boundaries. It doesn't just reside in one part of the world. It affects all aspects of our world. And it's in due in part because the Earth's circulatory system, it involves the atmosphere, the hydrosphere. All of these things are vulnerable to this. And in fact, there's this hypothesis you may have heard about called the Gaia hypothesis, developed by James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis. This was back in the 1970s, that addresses the feedback mechanisms that operate on a global scale to maintain the Earth in a dynamic equilibrium that favors the continuity of life. One example of this is the exchange of CO2 between the Earth and its environment. You think about it for a second. Large areas of forest, what do they intake? They intake CO2. This is part of the process for photosynthesis, is uptaking of CO2 and then giving off oxygen. So there's this exchange this feedback mechanism that operates on global scale to maintain life on Earth. That's just one example. Now, if we go from the global area down to an urban world. Now, earlier I talked about an urban world. More and more of our world is becoming urban. In fact, part of that is driven by technology and economics. Human population is rapidly urbanizing. You look at this particular figure here, you see the night lights across the U.S., and I can identify Houston, Texas down here. Look at the bright lights. You've got New York City here. You've got Chicago. Looks like Minneapolis. I believe that might be Kansas City, San Diego, Los Angeles, up here into Canada. People are moving more and more to the urban areas. However, this presents unique environmental challenges, but also provides us with the opportunity to help solve environmental problems. You begin to have urban areas where more resources are concentrated on, resources that can be used to solve problems related to things such as population growth. You can think as these urban areas expand, wetlands are filled in, forests are cut down, and soils are covered over with pavement and buildings. Now that's an issue. In fact, about 75% of the population in developed nations live in urban areas. 75% live in urban areas. Now that, again, is in developed nations. Now, if we look at developing nations, one thing that points to is the continent of Africa. Only about 40% live in developing nations. And by 2025, the projection is that almost 2/3 of the world population, in other words, 5 billion people, will live in cities. And they'll live in cities that they call megacities. In other words, these are urban areas with at least 10 million inhabitants. In fact, I'll just go ahead and show you this slide on urban cities. So 10 million inhabitants are located in developing countries. And it's estimated that by this year, by 2015, the majority of megacities will be in Asia. So this movement population will increase the role of the urban environment, both as a habitat and for its effects on other areas. So let's take a look at this particular graph of megacities. So you see our y-axis here is population in millions. It goes from 0 to 40 million. And then along the x-axis is a list of some of these megacities. Some of this you recognize: Tokyo, Mexico City, New York, Lagos, I believe, is in Nigeria, Buenos Aires, LA, and so on. So Beijing. What you notice, you see a lot of Asian cities represented here, and like we said, that the majority of the megacities will be in Asia. Now you have these bar graphs here, and so the light blue shows population in these megacities back in 1950. So if we look here at Tokyo, it appears that a shade over 10 million was in Tokyo back in the 1950s, whereas you go to the current, it's all the way up to 35 million. So in a short period, 65 years, they went from roughly 11 million to 36 million. In other words, they have tripled. That's right, they have tripled the number of people in the city. So people are flocking to urban areas. I mentioned Lagos. Notice now that roughly 17 million live in the city of Lagos. We look at Los Angeles. Their largest period of growth, their fastest rate of growth, occurred in the 1990s, you see here, with this longer purple area. And in fact, as I'm looking at this particular graph, the largest growth period, or the most rapid growth, tended to occur in the 1990s. Now think about that. Why do you think that occurred? What occurred in the 1990s? let you kind of mull that over. So, cities themselves actually have historically been sites of concentrated environmental damage. It makes sense. You have that many people in a small area and lack of green space. However, here is the advantage of those urban areas. They've become a learning tool for ecological footprint comparisons and a model for increasing the efficiency of dealing with transportation, resources, and water disposal. So that is the one positive there of the urbanization of cities across the world, is that resources are concentrated and can help in terms of transportation, waste, water, filtering of water is another area that would be a positive in that particular time. Now let's spend a moment to talk about people and nature. You know, if we look at this particular area, think about it like this. People and nature are actually intertwined. There were thoughts back in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s that people and nature operated somewhat mutually exclusive to each other. However, we know that we depend on nature for many things. Obviously, one of the most important things is air that we breathe, water that we need for our biological functions, fuel that which makes our life more comfortable and bearable. We depend upon nature for things like growing crops, an ozone layer to protect us from radiation, green plants for food and oxygen. I talked about that just a moment ago, the exchange of CO2 and oxygen with plants, and then wetlands to help filter water. So there, you can probably think of other examples where we depend upon nature as well. But like I was saying just a moment ago, back in the 20th century, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there was often a thought that basically humans and natures were separable. But what we found over the last 30 years, the problems and challenges that we face with the environment is now being looked at in terms of the relationship of people and nature together. So let's talk a little bit about science and values. Especially as we get to chapter 2, we're really going to talk about science, but solutions to our environmental problems. We were talking about some of the population growth that we have. To be able to solve environmental problems, we need to understand how the natural world works, basically natural science. We need to know enough to be able to find solutions and to recognize problems as problems when they arise, and then be able to examine them using some sort of scientific method and intellectual standards. Got a little tied up there. If we use the example of ozone depletion, back in the 1970s, there was a scientist, and I cannot think of his name right now, I'm drawing a blank, but he identified rapidly decreasing levels of ozone in the southern hemisphere. In fact, he actually found an ozone hole. Now keep in mind, ozone has a molecular structure of 2 oxygen atoms, so it's O3. It's 3 oxygen atoms together, O3. And so what ended up happening, some of the chlorofluorocarbons, in other words, some of the chemicals that you found in things like hairspray and underarm deodorant, these were used as propellants, and they would get up into the atmosphere, and what these chlorofluorocarbons would end up doing is they would break up the O3, the 3 atoms of oxygen, into O2 and monatomic oxygen. And so the O3, which is the ozone that would help protect us from ultraviolet radiation, You talk about UV rays, UVA, UVB, ultraviolet radiation. We'll talk a little bit about that later in this course. But those chlorofluorocarbons would get up into the atmosphere and break up the ozone into O2 and O, thus depleting our oxygen. And so this particular scientist actually was able to discover what the problem was, where the problem was coming from, chlorofluorocarbons, and how we could help to mitigate this particular type of occurrence of depletion of ozone. And since the 70s and 80s, when there were actions taken to ban chlorofluorocarbons and some of the refrigerant from our air conditioners, that has also been reduced, has helped lead to an increase in ozone, which leads to protect us from the ultraviolet radiation. That's just one example. So it's important for science to be able to identify what the issue is, how to fix the issue, and how to enforce it. And that not only requires science, but it also requires the political area to come in and actually help with that as well. So let's take a look at some intellectual standards. And we'll go through each one of these just briefly. But some of the things that we need from science is we need to have clarity when we're looking at a problem. We need to be able to accurately and precisely identify what the issues are. Now there is a difference between accuracy and precision. Think about it like this. Let's say that you are actually playing darts. Okay, many of us have played darts before, and to be accurate, we need to hit the bullseye. However, you can be precise, and in fact, you can take your 3 darts and get it at the bottom of the dartboard, but all 3 darts are within millimeters of each other. That's called precision. Your 3 darts very close together, even though it's not at the bullseye, but that's not considered accurate. So you have to be careful when you're looking at accuracy versus precision. In Chapter 2, we'll talk a lot more about accuracy and precision as an intellectual standard when we look at science. The relevance of the problem, the depth and breadth, what type of logic that we need to use to solve those types of problems, those types of challenges, and then the significance and fairness of this. Now let's talk a little bit about learning and discovery in environmental science. And this should be right up your alley of expertise, being education majors that is taking this course. You've heard of Bloom's taxonomy. We'll talk a little bit about that here in a moment. But in terms of learning and discovering in science, it takes place at various levels. You know that educators have utilized this hierarchical classification system known as Bloom's taxonomy to basically categorize learning into various domains, such as cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. It's important in environmental science, perhaps more so than any other area of scientific inquiry, to enable people to understand the field at higher cognitive and affective levels to fully grasp not only the scientific, but also the social and personal complexities involved. So in the cognitive domain that we're talking about here, we're talking specifically memory, judgment, synthesis, and reasoning. Now, as we go on to more of the affective domain, we begin to look at motivation, attitude, perception, and values. But as you're looking at this, discovery is the key element of the scientific process. In order to bring about substantive contributions to scientific inquiry, we need rigorous processes at many different levels. They must be pursued with diligence and hard work. utilizing these intellectual standards, as well as constantly trying to find relationships where perhaps none had existed before. And to do this, you need to have creativity, imagination, and perseverance as you're looking at these issues in environmental science. Now in Chapter 2, again I keep talking about Chapter 2, but in Chapter 2 we'll actually look at the scientific method, and you'll be able to apply Bloom's taxonomy to the scientific method. If we go a little bit more into this in terms of inquiry, we can look at different levels. We can study elements and processes of our particular study. We can find out relationships between independent variables. We'll define that in Chapter 2. Right now you can think of it in terms of cause and effect, but the independent variables are the causes, and the dependent variables are an effect. Let me just give you an example. Let's say, I'm trying to think, but I think your book uses an example in Chapter 2. I'm just going to hold off till we get there. But I guess the best way to describe this, your independent variable is something that you would change in an experiment to see what the outcome would be. The outcome would be the dependent variable. A lot of times, and it's not always like this, but a lot of times your x-axis is the independent variable and your y-axis will end up being the dependent variable, but not always. Like I said, I've got a better example in Chapter 2. Level 3 is when you begin to evaluate these relationships between variables over time. If we go back, let's go back and look at an earlier slide that we had here. So population growth. We can look at the effects that developing regions had on population growth. You find that from 1950 up to 2015, population growth was pushed by developing regions such as the continent of Africa, portions of South America. That's really what drove the growth, not necessarily the growth in developed regions like in Asia and in North America. But like I said, we'll get back more to that a little bit later. So this leads to something we call the precautionary principle. And the precautionary principle, you see here, was actually developed during the conference or a summit on sustainable development back in 1992. And basically what the precautionary principle tells us is that given uncertainties of scientific inquiry, use of the precautionary principle is really prudent to prevent irreversible environmental harm. So in other words, when we have a situation, and I will just use global climate change because it's something that has been in the news for the last 30 years and is a current event that we have with the recent conference in France back in December. So there are some uncertainties on whether global warming, well, the gist of it is we know global warming is occurring, but the thing that's creating the issue is what is causing the global warming. Is this just natural variability of the planet, or is it something that we as humans have helped to cause? And that's where the disagreement comes in between pro and con in terms of the global warming issue. Is it caused by humans, or is it just natural variability of our planet? But if we use the precautionary principle in this term, a lot of these conferences, these summits you see are suggesting, and in fact strongly suggesting, a reduction in our carbon footprint, such as the use of fossil fuels. So you've got politicians involved in this, economists, scientists. A lot of this is involved, and some of the scientists are saying that in terms of the precautionary principle, we need to take steps now to reduce CO2 input into the atmosphere so as we don't create issues for future generations. We do not have a final say on global climate change at this point. There's still research being done on both sides, but if we use the precautionary principle here, we assume that this is an issue and we need to start taking steps now if you're looking at it in terms of the precautionary principle. In other words, let's be proactive, not reactive. Now we can think of the value of the environment in terms of 8 justifications. Now there's more than that, but you see the ones right here: utilitarian, ecological, aesthetic, from a recreational standpoint, inspirational, creative, moral, and cultural. In terms of utilitarian value, we can look at it in terms of the value of timber and mineral wealth that can be extracted, are relatively easy to evaluate. In terms of an ecological value, we can think of it in terms of life support functions for ecosystems, the water quality benefits that derive from ecosystems, and so on. In terms of moral justification, basically refers to the rights of all living things to exist. And in terms of cultural values, they're the support provided by ecosystems to unique and valuable cultures, such as the Cajun culture down in Louisiana is one example. We can also look at the aesthetic side of something based upon how beautiful something is or how it makes us feel. That is kind of more of the inspirational justification. And of course, a lot of us look at the environment in terms of recreational, fishing, hunting, snow skiing, those types of things would come to mind. And then, of course, the creative justification would be an aid to human creativity. So now we've come to the end of Chapter 1. There are 6 themes that really run through this particular chapter. We talked about the population issue in terms of how that creates stress and strain on our environment. We talked a little bit about the importance of urban environments. We see their population growth is beginning to concentrate itself in those particular areas. And as our population continues to grow, like I said, that creates stress and strain on our resources. So we need to look at it in terms of sustainability of existing resources. Also looking at resources kind of outside of the box, such as wind energy is one thing that comes to mind. Also the importance of looking at things in terms of a global, not only a global economy, but also a global nature. The things that take place or that happen across the Pacific in China has an effect on what happens across North America, which in turn has an effect on what happens in Europe, and so on. We need to look at terms of people and nature. They are not a mutually exclusive type of situation. People use the environment, and the environment is good for people. And then the role of science. We talk about how science can identify problems, present potential solutions, and then, of course, also we need to look at how, like I said, population growth is the key thing. So we're going to look at not only population but also sustainability, especially in the 21st century. We'll also take a look at how technology has impacted population, how that impacts the environment, and then as we're heading toward an increasingly urban world, we need to look towards cities to see how they have impacts on the environment. And then I think really one of the keys here, and this is not an answer we'll be able to come up with initially, but is figuring out how much the Earth can actually hold in terms of human population and to continue to be able to use resources without depleting those. This will have an impact on future generations. So, the last part, we look at scientific knowledge, critical thinking, sound judgment. Those three things we'll talk about in Chapter 2. We also have to look at how these scientific solutions, how they affect ethics and practices. And then finally the precautionary principle, which came out of the conference or summit in Rio in 1992, is a powerful tool and is especially being used in terms of global climate change. So we will move on to the next chapter shortly, and have a good evening.